Today, I'm going to try to build a clock. A mechanical clock and scrap mechanic. So, let's start. So, I will start... I think it'd be easier to build like a small test first. So that's what I'll do. I started by creating the base and then gave it pillars. My idea was that these pillars would be either side of the mechanism and then the piece in the middle would swing. When I started making the arm, I realized that I was going to need way more space than I had though, so I tried to expand it on both sides, which I eventually did. After that though, it looked like a messy mess, but I tried to work with it because this was just supposed to be a proof of concept. After standing back, I realized that there was no way that I was going to fit a gear onto this, and... Okay, I'm gonna scrap this whole thing. I don't like it. After that success, I moved on to designing the finished product. I discovered this concave wedge, which I wasn't super sure was actually going to be useful, but I noted it anyway and went ahead and moved on. I did actually end up using it. I started by making the first gear, which I was going to make out of pipe pieces and wedges. I duplicated this shape 4 times all around the side of the hub. I actually realized that I wanted more than 4 sides to this gear, which meant I had to add a controller to allow a second layer to be offset from the first, as you'll see. I welded this controller into the spoke of the gear. I then basically had to duplicate this whole layer above at a 45-degree angle. And then I added more wedges on the top and bottom of the layers so that the 2 layers were on the same plane and meshed together. I put it off and on the lift just to make sure it was still working, and it spun kind of weird, but it seemed to be working alright, so I went ahead and moved on. I built a wall and then put a bearing on it. I welded the gear to the bearing, and after looking at it I realized the gear was actually facing the wrong direction compared to the animation, but I didn't think it would be an issue at the time. I gave the wall some legs so I could put it on a lift, and I then started to build the rocking mechanism at the top, onto which I put a reverse-facing pipe piece so I could couple it to the pendulum later. I added an electric engine so that I could start testing the mechanism, and in an actual clock this gear would be continuous spun by a gravity-fed rotating wheel. After that seemed to work alright, I moved on to testing the rocking part. I had no idea how to test this, and in hindsight I realized I had no idea what I was doing or how it was even supposed to work, so I tried to hook up a controller to it. This didn't really make any sense, and it kept getting stuck, but here it is anyway. Following that failure, I moved on to the coupling mechanism to the pendulum. I used a piston and a bearing because pistons don't have collision with other objects. If this were made in real life, this would be the equivalent of having an axle pass through the wood. After welding the pieces together, I built the arm and then the large metal weight at the bottom of the pendulum. After hitting the pendulum, you can see that the rocking bar rotates as well, and the piston passes through the supports. After again thinking about testing, I messed with a bunch of options for the rocker, but I came up blank for now. It was about this time that I realized, okay, the gear needs to be modified. I needed to modify the gear to put different angles on it to make it more closely resemble the gear in the animation. I did this by adding concave wedges mentioned earlier, and while I was at it I gave the hub a pass through so that I could flip the gear around to make it match the orientation. The game got a little confused here because it kept all these spokes attached, but it made my life a lot easier because I could just weld them all on together. This pass through actually had the added benefit that allowed me to put a hand on the clock at the end of the video. After the modifications, I attached the new gear in place of the old one and went back to working on the swivel. The gear got really finicky and needed to be taken on and off the lift a fear times before it expanded correctly, but I finally got there and continued on. I thought really hard about how I wanted to test the swivel mechanism and even came up with this extraordinarily obtuse piston mechanism to push the pendulum back and forth, but never got it working. It had the added benefit of sounding hilarious when sped up though. And in hindsight, I realized that there was no testing needed here. I just needed to get all the pieces functioning together. I didn't need to manually push this pendulum back and forth. I spent a lot of time working on this swivel piece. I tried adding convex wedges, normal wedges, full blocks, pipe pieces, curved pipes, making the arms longer, shorter, wider, and so much more. Nothing I added seemed to quite work right, but I felt I was getting closer, and I knew that as soon as I got this geometry correct, everything should just work. I eventually got the left one pretty much perfect and had to get the right one to work with it. The right one kept getting locked in place, and while that was almost right, it also needed to have the ability to slide out and reset. Eventually, the geometry on the right arm was correct, and after lots and lots of small tweaks, this happened. This is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. It looks super stupid up there, but it works. Okay. Now, if I put it on a lift and take it off the lift, it's super broken. Well, yeah, but after fixing that... There it is. Okay, now if I turn this on, it should just work. Oh, that is so cool. After all that work, I finally got it working, and the pendulum looked so good. It was far from perfect, and if you look, you can see that the left swing is still longer than the right one, but I think it's the best I could have done on this scale. After patching up some holes, I sat back and watched it for far too long, enjoying the hypnotic nature of the mechanism. I watched it for like 2 minutes. I then went on to save the spare mechanism on the lift in case I wanted just the raw mechanism again in the future, just to stare at it. I then started to build the enclosure for the clock mechanism, starting with the walls, and then eventually moving on to the floor. I had to work around the lift here, which was a little weird, but eventually I got there. I built up the walls a little bit more, and then I realized I wanted to rebuild the pendulum mechanism to make sure it was still going to work in its new enclosure. I made the pendulum a little bit longer, and then also made it a bit more circular so that it would resemble more closely an original pendulum clock. I hooked it up to a motor and did some testing, and then I realized that the pendulum was now hitting the left wall of its enclosure, which made the overall mechanism not work. So I moved on to expanding the sides of that enclosure in what was probably the least efficient way possible, but I got there in the end and it seemed to work alright. I then took a step back just to make sure it was still working and to admire the new pendulum. The next step was to move on to the aesthetic details, and I didn't really have an exact plan here. I just kind of wanted it to look like these tiny grandfather clocks you see. I added some borders and then filled out the overall shape while still trying to make sure that the mechanism was intact and functioning properly. Then I took another step back just to see what it looked like, and I was really liking the way it looked so far. I know it's not perfect and there's plenty of details I could have added, and it's very blocky, but the goal of this was to show off the mechanism, not really my building skills. I then moved on to the clock face, and I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to do this on such a small scale, but I knew for sure I wanted to make it out of glass so that you could still see the mechanism underneath, and I kind of just went and rolled with that. I went ahead and put that gear all the way through and then added an arm on the outside so that you could see it rotating. I moved the button to the exterior and added some glass in front of the pendulum so you couldn't get inside. And then I took a step back to admire my work. Finally, I added some finishing trim and moved on to painting. And I won't show you the whole painting process because it was pretty mundane, and I know for a fact I missed some spots and I didn't do the entire internals and all kinds of stuff, but that's not what this is about. Finally, after some tweaking, repainting, a few minor fixes, and then trying to figure out how to paint a YouTube logo, I finally got it working, and here's the final product. If you want to download this clock, a link will be in the description for the workshop page. Subscribe and you'll see it on your lift. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, leave a like. I'm pretty new to this, and I want to know how much you enjoy this style of video. If you want to see more content from me, please subscribe. It means a lot, and I put a lot of time into this video. Thanks for watching.